Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 92. We are moving our way forward towards our big episode number 100 in regular counting. We're very excited about that. With our book today, which is not really necessarily a book at all. As a matter of fact, if you order it, it really comes in as kind of an essay. I actually sent a link of it to Libby earlier, and you could find it anywhere online. But it's a screed, right, in sort of essay format. It's really what you would probably call a blog post, or maybe these days you would call it a Substack entry. Now that Medium has been shuttered and has gone by the wayside. It is a piece of writing that proposes to describe what happens to a man or a woman after they come to themselves, right? And the writer of this essay, this screed, this glorified Substack in book form, was an early 20th century scientific rationalist progressive. And he was also tinged by his parents' Christianity. It's a curious volume that we will break down and link to events happening today around techno-optimism, AI, acceleration versus deacceleration, and the intersection where all of that lands, at the intersection of politics and culture. This is going to be one of those complicated weaving sorts of podcasts, but don't worry, as I've been promising you all this year, we are going to present solutions to problems, because I do think there are some solutions that we can gain from understanding this particular piece of writing that we are going to explore today. Today, we are reading Woodrow Wilson's When a Man Comes to Himself. Now, I have an open source edition that you can go ahead and order anywhere where you order books. As I said previously, or as I just mentioned, Libby has a link to it, and I will have this link in the show notes where you can go and check out this essay. And speaking of Libby, I'd like to welcome back for a brand new year of podcasts, my still semi-regular co-host, although she would like to ascend to regular co-host status, Libby Unger. How you doing, Libby? Welcome back.
You're not supposed to expose my ambitions.
Well, yeah, we're all getting exposed here.
Yes, exactly. They've been exposed now. Yeah, time to up the ante.
Yeah.
I just enjoy this so much. Great intellectual fodder for the mind. So thank you. It's great to be back, and I'm
awesome.
Delighted. This book or essay was amazing.
Yeah, it definitely is it's definitely a piece of writing. I'll grant you that. And I was very surprised when I read it. And so we're going to open with When a Man Comes to Himself by Woodrow Wilson. And I quote directly, "It is a very wholesome and regenerating change which a man undergoes when he comes to himself. It is not only after periods of recklessness or infatuation, when he has played the spendthrift or the fool, that a man comes to himself. He comes to himself after experiences of which he alone may be aware, when he has left off being wholly preoccupied with his own powers and interests, and with every petty plan that centers in himself, when he has cleared his eyes to see the world as it is, and his own true place and function in it." It is a process of disillusionment. The scales have fallen away. He sees himself soberly and knows under what conditions his powers must act as well as what his powers are. He has got rid of earlier prepossessions about the world of men and affairs, both those which were too favorable and those which were too unfavorable, both those of the nursery and those of a young man's reading. He has learned his own paces, or at any rate, is in a fair way to learn them, has found his footing and the true nature of the going he must look for in the world, over what sorts of roads he must expect to make his running, and at what expenditure of effort, whither his goal lies, and what cheer he may expect by the way. It is a process of disillusionment, but it disheartens no soundly made man. It brings him into a light which guides instead of deceiving him, a light which does not make the way look cold to any man whose eyes are fit for use in the open, but which shines wholesomely, rather upon the obvious path, like the honest rays of the frank sun, and makes traveling both safe and cheerful. Woodrow Wilson was born December 28th, 1856, and he died February 3rd, 1924. As a matter of fact, we are approaching, at the time of this recording in 2024, we are about 2 weeks away from the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's death. He was the titular head of the modern progressive movement in America and its most notorious face. He made campaign promises to keep American troops out of World War I, and of course, he broke those. And he led the charge on first creating the Federal Reserve and then the passing of the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That created the IRS, and he advocated for the League of Nations. So I guess 2 out of 3, if you're a progressive, ain't bad. Woodrow Wilson was also the president of Princeton University before he was president of the United States of America, and was a notable academic at that institution. However, his academic credentials rendered him somewhat naive in his approach to power politics and to the game of power politics in Washington, D.C., and led him to being easily disappointed as a social reformer. And it is through this lens of social reform that the essay, When a Man Comes to Himself, is actually written. Finally, Woodrow Wilson, and if you listen to a lot of Glenn Beck, you will note this as well. So I'm not saying anything that you can't already get anywhere else on the internet. Wilson was a notorious racist. As a matter of fact, he was one of the last American presidents elected who was actually born and lived through the Civil War. He was raised in an old Southern Confederate aristocratic mindset that would be an anachronism to modern political progressives' minds, as well as modern conservatives' minds. And his politics were, by our standard in 2024, outrightly bigoted against immigrants, African Americans, as I've already mentioned, and women. Or they were in favor, on the other end, of applying evolutionary Darwinism to the engineering of society. And he ended up, or was part of a movement that ended up promoting eugenics and abortion as a form of social engineering. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a character. Well, not a character. He was a man. I don't want to put character on him because he was a real flesh and blood human being. He was a human being who was complicated and contradictory, as all human beings are. And we can discuss and argue about whether or not he was a good president. I personally probably would have had a problem with his policies. But I also think that we have to wrestle with him. And the reason, part of the other reason why we're reading When a Man Comes to Himself is because we just read Theodore Roosevelt's Essays on Practical Politics that was written when Roosevelt was in the New York State Assembly. and was written in during a time when he had not yet ascended to running for president. And Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican progressive, coming out of an aristocratic Victorian mindset, a very northern aristocratic Victorian mindset. And Woodrow Wilson was basically the southern version of this on the Democrat side. Democrats and Republicans can both be political progressives. And part of the reason we're also following up with this during this first month of the podcast in 2024 is because, of course, we are in an election year. We cannot get past that in America. But just like we started with Plato's Republic, the key question that sits at the base of Woodrow Wilson's feet, as well as Teddy Roosevelt's and ours in 2024, is this: what kind of people do we want to have ruling us? What kind of people do we want to vote for? What kind of Americans do we want to have? And so I'm going to talk with all of this and many other areas as we project forward to the future, because this core question, what kind of Americans do we want to have, isn't going to go away. And so we're going to talk about all of this with Libby today. And I want to open up my questions to Libby with this one. Let's talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. What do you know about Woodrow Wilson? What do you know about his political achievements? It's 100 years almost now after his death. We see the results of some of his political achievements, I would argue, in our society and culture in America. And when a man comes to himself, has to be read, I think, through that lens of what those achievements actually were. So tell me what your thoughts are, Libby, to open up your comments. What are your thoughts on Woodrow Wilson and the politics of progressivism?
Yeah, so I always think it's important to view things, through the lens of the time as much as we can. Huh. And in preparing for today, I reread, the background on Woodrow Wilson, and the fact that his parents were Southern, supported the South. They were Northerners who supported the South, and moved to the South with his father, a minister, chaplain, and ultimately in the Confederate army. When Wilson was growing up, he was born right before the Civil War, so he witnessed the Civil War, Confederates being killed, and then also the Reconstruction, and we know how poorly managed the Reconstruction was. From the impact on the freed slaves, not being really provided a good transition. So what I looked at specifically was when he wrote this, and he was 45. It was right before he became president of Princeton, before he was governor of New Jersey. And at 45, he was moving from being a professor, likely more in service of self. How do I become more important? How do I learn? How do I become valued? And shifting more into becoming service to others. And that's when he, became head of Princeton, focused on Princeton's becoming more academically oriented from an area of higher achievement. One of the things, though, that was noteworthy is that he did not allow women or blacks.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he was, governor of New Jersey, he was he was pushing the antitrust, which was great. He was pushing the antitrust. He was pushing for safer workplaces, and he took that forward into his presidency. So, we saw, the FTC, even though the Sherman Antitrust Act had been, implemented in the 1800s, we didn't have any mechanism for really implementing it in a meaningful way. And so the FTC was created underneath Wilson. You did have the Federal Reserve, and if we look at the Federal Reserve and the benefits of it today from a centralized banking, as well as, a board that you can manage, interest rates and, money printing and all that kind of fun thing, it's controversial, but there's no doubt that we have been able to grow as a country and as a global economic power because of the policies around on the Fed. So the Fed actually was, I would say, a success. The FTC was a success. Some of the workplace practices, like limiting children, the age with which children can work in the workplace, trying to create safer work environments. So your predecessor to OSHA.
Mhm.
You know, then you start to see, some of the more trials and tribulations of a politician who has, backers that he needs to make happy. And so with the entry into World War I in his second term, he had promised not to do that in his first term. In his second term, he did it, and he did it, to preserve the industrialist businesses in Europe.
Mhm.
So while he was antitrust at home, wanting, small businesses to be able to thrive, recognizing the value of competition, we did go to war to support the last year of World War I, basically at the behest of the industrialists. Um, you know, uh, you know, the other thing, and then we start to get into more of where his own biases were showing up, and where sometimes he would go counter to them. So he was anti-women voting. He didn't think they were smart enough. They didn't have the wisdom to be able to vote correctly. But during World War I, there was a significant reliance on women while the men were at war. He recognized the value of them as a potential voting bloc, and so he shifted his position on suffrage, women's suffrage, and was initially against it, and then for it. But the most troubling was, he was one of two presidents who'd served in the Confederate Army. He was 50 years after the fact. He was elected, or actually not served in the Confederate Army, but grew up during the Confederacy.
Mhm.
And he had big the Southern Democratic bloc backing him. He resegregated the federal workforce, which had been one of the few places where Blacks were allowed to work, were able to make money and rise up in economic stature. He segregated that. You saw a rise in Jim Crow in the South underneath his presidency. You saw Jim Crow laws implemented in the Navy. So there was very much a step back around Black rights and Black lives underneath him. And there's no doubt that he had very racist biases. I can maybe sit in his shoes to see what he had maybe seen. That doesn't mean that I am supportive or believe that, any of his history and what he'd experienced would in any way justify division, the division that he was promoting. I think it's grotesque. And what's really interesting is his grandparents were actually anti-slavery Northerners. So when we talk about, when we look back at you inherit the sins of your fathers, like, how many families actually go counter to their parents, the family, the family legacy before them. And his family, his parents specifically were pro-slavery. He was also, his family came over from Ireland, and he was anti-immigrant. So people are complex, and you never know what's really driving motivations. Some of it is money and backers, like the industrialists forcing us into World War I. And then some of it is our ingrained biases. about, and for him specifically, it was towards women and, and blacks. And, and he just went to where it was the most politically um, safe to support his biases.
So there's a tension
Yeah.
inside of Woodrow Wilson, right? But there's a
Right.
tension, honestly, inside of a lot of the, I think we're postmodern. I'm not going to say pre-modern. The modern progressive movement, there is a tension.
Mhm.
And everybody knows it. And here's the tension. And this is where you get Republicans as progressives and you get Democrats as progressives. And by the way, in the postmodern definition of Republican and Democrat, I mean, think John McCain and Harry Reid. They were both progressive. I think
Mhm.
we can reasonably say that, right? Now that those gentlemen have gone off to other places, both of them. And are having other conversations with other entities someplace else. Anyway, the tension in the modern progressive movement is the tension between this idea of and this is what I want to tie into Marc Andreesen's Techno-Optimist manifesto.
Mhm.
I want to tie some things together here. It's the tension between the ideas that man is formed by society and culture. And if society and culture were just better, man would be better versus on the other end of that tension, society and culture come about as a result of something that is wrong inside of individual human beings, right? And this is something that Plato began exploring in the Republic. This is obviously something that came to maturity underneath or within the context of Christianity in the West, but it also came to maturity in the East underneath Buddhism and other philosophical and religious formulations in the East. But fundamentally, this tension exists. Is man perfectible? And society is the one that's screwed up, or is society perfectible and man is the one that's screwed up? And this is the tension that exists inside of the modern progressive movement. And you see it in Woodrow Wilson, specifically in all the areas that you mentioned. So, um, he was not a populist. And that's the thing that we don't, in 2024, in our modern era, we don't like hierarchies. We don't like to talk about hierarchies or class. But in 1924, and during Wilson's life, class and aristocracy, and we see this with Roosevelt too, meant something. Like Roosevelt even says in Essays on Practical Politics, he talks about how in New York, in the New York Assembly, some women suffragists came to him and wanted to talk with him about women getting the vote. And his only complaint was that the way they wrote up their demands was totally outside of parliamentary procedure. And so he tried to help them and they would not take any advice. And he literally writes in Essays on Practical Politics, we read this in episode number 91. He writes, I tried to help them because I am for women having the right to vote, much to the dismay of my family members. Interesting. Then you go to Woodrow Wilson on the other side, politically speaking, because this is the era we live in now of blue and red, right? And you go to Wilson on the other side, and Wilson's like, they're not useful until they are. And that's the tension inside of Wilson. And it's the tension between that aristocratic perspective. And every picture you see of him, he's got a top hat and a cane on. He's got the monocle, looks like Mr. Peanut. He's not trying to be the common man. He sees himself as being above the common man. And I think that is reflected in kind of the things you're talking about around Wilson, that idea of social reform for children, and for regular people, quote unquote. But I'm still enough of an aristocrat that I can like hold on to like D.W. Griffith and yeah, some of those separations between the races. So I'm going to do social reform, but I'm not going to go all the way, right? Or I'm going to keep the hierarchy because there are classes in my conception of class because of how I was raised in an aristocratic South. And I'm not going to get past that. Even at Princeton, when you talk about him being a president of Princeton, one of the comments that was made about him, I think it was by John Dewey, was that basically Woodrow Wilson came in and was going to change or reform Princeton, and it just became more of the aristocratic place that it had always been after he had left, and he didn't change or reform anything because being president of Princeton was a mark of class rather than something that needed, rather than indicating something that needed to be reformed. And now we fast forward to, of course, 2024, and not to bring in too much current events, but we have president of Harvard who's still collecting a $900,000 salary after plagiarism calls, or not calls, but after plagiarism got her fired from being the Harvard president. Well,
versus the anti-Semitic
bingo.
leanings, right?
Right, exactly. Which again are about not the anti-Semitism, or in Woodrow Wilson's case, the racism. It's about class. And we don't talk about class in this country in real kinds of terms at all, which fundamentally is why I don't think Marxism ever really got a foothold in our country beyond really the academic circles and some other places at a cultural level. But at a real political revolution level, I mean, Eugene V. Debs is the high watermark, and then that's it. We're done.
But Marxism is playing out through identity politics.
Correct. Yes, I'll
right?
grant you. Yes, absolutely,
Yes.
for sure.
Because
Yes.
the game on class wasn't working.
Right.
So we've bundled it up in identity politics, be it whatever the identity of the day is that
Absolutely.
is held back or held down, is oppressed.
Correct.
I do think there's an intellectual superiority that goes hand in hand with aristocracy or hierarchy. Today we don't have aristocracy, but we have that intellectual elitism.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton implies it in calling half the country deplorables because their intellectual understanding is not to her liking. And with Claudine Gay, what was really interesting is I didn't know that she had gone to Andover. So she went to Andover, Stanford, Harvard. So she's had no intellectual diversity in her entire, in her entire educational life. You and I know many of those through my career, and I used to say when in tech is that we have no diversity on the leadership teams. Everyone may look different, but the thinking is all the same.
Yep.
And that's her experience has just been a big bubble.
Yep.
Well,
it's hard.
Black or white, that experience is a bubble.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. I think it's hard for, you talk about on the tech side. I think it's hard for Google to, not Google, I won't pick on Google. I think it's hard for a startup to recruit from, I won't pick
because
on Google.
You're on
it's
their
too
platform.
Easy. No, because it's too easy to pick on Google.
Yeah. Okay.
It's too easy. It's like, it's like kicking whatever your demagogue is of the day. It's too easy.
Right.
It's too easy to kick Google. Or Amazon, or I'm not going to kick any of those guys. Instead, I'm going to kick unnamed startup here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think it's hard for them to recruit from a community college. I just think it is. I just don't think it ever. If you're going from Andover to Stanford to Harvard, or here's a more realistic path. If you are the smartest person in your Iowa high school, and you apply to Stanford and get accepted at Stanford when you're 18, you're never going back to Iowa.
That's right.
It's never happening. And now, on the one hand, that's the promise of America. You talk about World War I. One of the things that was said about the doughboys coming back to America from World War I was, how are you going to keep them down on the farm now that they've seen gay Paris? Back when gay meant fun and exciting and interesting and lavish and decadent, right? Well, that's the same thing can be applied, to that Iowa high school student who went to Stanford because they were the smartest person in their Iowa high school with, discrete derivative mathematics, right? That no one else, derivative calculus that no one else could do. Great. Well, you can't do, now you're going to go work on AI and build technology and stuff. Well, after you've seen Stanford, how are you going to get them to go back to Iowa?
But this is shifting, and this is the most recent discussion that I heard, between Marc Andreesen and Ben Horowitz is talking about the erosion of the Ivy Leagues,
Mm.
Ivy League schools, because they're no longer viewed as meritocratic. It
Meritocratic, yep.
has to do with the quality of the students that are coming out. You know, what we saw happen at Harvard and MIT, is just, an example of the root cause of why the quality of students coming out isn't as great. But specifically, Ben or Mark were talking about some of the companies that they work with. They used to drool over being able to get an engineer from Stanford. And now the quality of the Stanford engineer is not what it used to be. And they can find great engineers from a lot of different places. So that default hiring by the Silicon Valley tech companies from only the top Ivy Leagues, there's been an erosion in it. It wasn't explicitly because of what we've been seeing with it not being as meritocratic.
It's a hard word to get your mouth around.
But now people are understanding what's happened, that we're not bringing people in based on merit. We're lowering kind of the standards. And then, grade inflation was obscene when I was, in the 90s. It's now extremely obscene. All you have to do is get into a school and you're set for life. You don't really have to prove yourself over and over again. So it's interesting, that some folks are moving to community colleges, or people who've maybe went 2 years at community college and then 2 year and transferred, because those are the hungry people who are willing to do the work.
Well, and you talk about the Ivy Leagues, and again, it's just like Google. It's easy to kick the Ivy Leagues these days,
Right.
and part of it is they brought it on themselves. I mean, let's be realistic here. And as a person who taught and worked as an administrator in higher education for almost 20 years, collectively, I can tell you there are great people working in those Ivy League institutions, and the institutions need to be reformed from the inside.
Both can be true. Yes.
Both can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if we're going to put all the cards on the table, it is the faculty of those institutions that have dropped the ball on reforming those institutions. The fact of the matter is that a lot of those institutions, not just the Ivy League ones, even in state schools, which is where I spent most of my career in higher education, even in those state schools, the ratio of administrators to faculty is overwhelmingly in favor of administrators rather than faculty. And that's insane.
That's the problem that we're seeing across every industry right now.
Absolutely.
Is the product makers are becoming, the product makers and the value creators are becoming the minority. They should be the majority. So in healthcare, when I was doing healthcare M&A in the late 90s, you were supposed to cap your administrative costs at 15%. They've tripled the number of administrators in healthcare since that time. And that has to do with regulations and, and all these, and insurance and all the things that the government's made more complicated. But we have administrators, and the management class has just expanded, and seeing that also in education, right?
Yeah.
So
well, and I wonder if, and we're going to talk about, we are going to talk about the Marc Andreesen's Techno-Optimist manifesto here coming up in a little bit. But I wonder if that's where all of the hair on fire hyperventilating is coming from about allegedly artificial intelligence, but really large language algorithms. Because if you really want to manage regulation, let's just take healthcare for an example, that is coming in where bills are being passed by Congress that come in at, let's be conservative here, 2,400 pages. What's the best way to do analysis on 2,400 pages and to find the best way through? Well, the best way to do analysis on a 2,400 page document is to feed it into Chat GPT 6, have it do the analysis, and spit out something for you. Now, all of a sudden, the number of administrators that you need go from 25% in your organization down to 5% of your organization.
If you're lucky.
if you're
And I
lucky.
mean, if we're lucky in a positive way, right?
Right,
So,
absolutely. I'm talking the
yeah, I
upside.
mean, clearly what we have going on, the management class is also the consumption class, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you have too many people who know how to consume and manage in nanny state, and not enough who know how to create and build and grow. And so there's a lot of people who've been living heavy on the hog, who are high on the hog, who are looking at that and saying, "Uh-oh."
Uh-oh. The gravy train might be pulling into the station.
Yeah, but as we transition into the conversations, what I loved about the techno-optimism, I am one of those. I'm just an optimist in general. I believe that,
Yeah.
if you look at history, we're moving up and towards the right. What Wilson was talking about was when you move from service to self and service to others, when
Yeah.
you're about growing and learning and building in support of others, but you have the autonomy and choice to do that.
Right.
That is when society thrives.
Right. Well,
Yes.
speaking of which, good segue. See, this is why she's going to become our regular. She's working on it. She's
Metric
working
number
it, folks.
1, we just identified it. Woo, please. Yeah.
She's working on it, folks.
Yeah,
She's
I
coming
love
in
it.
hot. She's coming in hot. All right, back to the book. Back to When a Man Comes to Himself, or the essay by Woodrow Wilson. Now, we're going to pick up in part 4. We're going to read a couple of things here. It is a mistake to suppose that the great captains of industry, speaking about captains of industry, the great organizers and directors of manufacture and commerce and monetary exchange are engrossed in a vulgar pursuit of wealth. By the way, pause. This is a mistake we make all the time in our era. We presume that these folks are engaged in or engrossed in a vulgar pursuit of wealth. I did highlight that. Back to the essay. Too often they suffer the vulgarity of wealth. They suffer the vulgarity of wealth to display itself in the idleness and ostentation of their wives and children who devote themselves, it may be, to expense regardless of pleasure. But we ought not to misunderstand even that or condemn it unjustly. The masters of industry are often too busy with their own sober and momentous calling to have time or spare thought enough to govern their own households. A king may be too faithful a statesman to be a watchful father. These men are not fascinated by the glitter of gold. The appetite for power has got hold upon them. They are in love with the exercise of their faculties upon a great scale. They are organizing and overseeing a great part of the life of the world. No wonder they are captivated. Business is more interesting than pleasure, as Mr. Bagehot said, and when once the mind has caught its zest, there's no disengaging it. The world has reason to be grateful for that fact. It was this fascination that had got hold upon the faculties of the man whom the world was afterward to know, not as a prince among merchants, for the world forgets merchant princes. That's true. But as a prince among benefactors, for beneficence breeds gratitude, admiration, fame, and the world remembers its benefactors. Business and business alone interested him, or seemed to him worthwhile. The first time he was asked to subscribe money for a benevolent object, he declined. Why should he subscribe? What affair would be set forward? What increase of efficiency would the money buy? What return would it bring in? Was good money to be simply given away, like water poured on a barren soil, to be sucked up and yield nothing? It was not until men who understood benevolence on its sensible, systematic, practical, and really helpful side explained it to him as an investment that his mind took hold of it and turned to it for satisfaction. He began to see that education was a thing of infinite usury, that money devoted to it would yield a singular increase to which there was no calculable end, an increase in perpetuity, increase of knowledge and therefore of intelligence and efficiency, touching generation after generation with new impulses, adding to the sum total of the world's fitness for affairs, and invisible but intensely real spiritual usury beyond reckoning, because compounded in an unknown ratio from age to age. Henceforth, beneficence was as interesting to him as business, was indeed a sort of sublimated business in which money moved new forces in a commerce which no man could bind or limit. He had come to himself, to the full realization of his powers, the true and clear perception of what it was in his mind demanded for its satisfaction. His faculties were consciously stretched to their right measure, were at last exercised at their best. He felt the keen zest, not of success merely, but also of honor, and was raised to a sort of majesty among his fellow men, who attended him in death like a dead sovereign. He had died dwarfed had he not broken the bonds of mere money-getting, would never have known himself had he not learned how to spend it, and ambition itself could not have shown him a straighter road to fame. That is a fascinating piece of writing right there, and it reveals the strain that exists in progressivism from the time of Woodrow Wilson all the way to now. And this is the strain. The focus of late 19th and early 20th century political progressives, Wilson among them, but including Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger, William Howard Taft, was how to get all these newly minted Industrial Revolution era / Gilded Age millionaires, not billionaires, but millionaires, to play along with society and spread their money around. And in essence, that's what Woodrow Wilson is pushing there. He's persuading, he's building a straw man, but he's persuading the millionaire, not billionaire, but the millionaire to part with his cash for social good. He's trying to lay the foundations for, in our time, what would be called conscious capitalism. And we can talk a little bit about that if we'd like. Now, the primary way that most of those Gilded Age / Industrial Revolution era millionaires were persuaded to give away their money was through the establishment of foundations, libraries, and educational institutions dedicated to learning. That's why he brings up education. Back in that time, education was not a publicly funded good. Okay. Tax dollars at the state level and at the federal level did not go to education. There was no Department of Education as there is in our time. The big belief among late 19th and early 20th century political progressives was that the primary problem of the masses, and this is the aristocratic piece, the primary problem with the masses was that they just weren't educated well enough to make rational decisions. By the way, this same conceit, after 100 years of public education, still exists in modern political progressives. But there's a twist in here, because for every gift, there is a curse. And the curse here, or the underside, the Minority Report, I've been taken to saying that recently quite a bit. I don't know why, but the Minority Report underneath the Majority Report on education as a way to lift the masses is this. The Minority Report is that we're actually that average people aren't smart enough. I'm going to be gentle. Average people aren't smart enough to understand the technologies that have been thrust upon us by the likes of our current billionaire gilded class, the Musks, the Andreesens, the Reid Hoffmans, the Peter Thiels of the world. That we aren't necessarily intelligent enough to handle the tools that we have been handed, like Prometheus grabbing lightning from God and bringing it down the mountain. The other knock, which kind of goes along with this, and this again gets into this idea of what is techno-optimism, is that we are blocked by ideologies of the 20th century as a mass of people. And these ideologies include Marxism, socialism, etc. And we're too blocked to support rational public policies. And by the way, don't believe me. I'm going to quote directly from Marc Andreesen's The Techno-Optimist Manifesto, recently released on Substack. And I quote directly from Marc: lies. We are being lied to. We are told that technology takes our jobs, reduces our wages, increases inequality, threatens our health, ruins the environment, degrades our society, corrupts our children, impairs our humanity, threatens our future, and is ever on the verge of ruining everything. We are told to be angry, bitter, and resentful about technology. We are told to be pessimistic. The myth of Prometheus, in various updated forms like Frankenstein, Oppenheimer, and Terminator, haunts our nightmares. We are told to denounce our birthright, our intelligence, our control over nature, our ability to build a better world. We are told to be miserable about the future. That's how Marc Andreesen opens his Techno-Optimist Manifesto. But that's just I read that, and God bless Marc. We're going to talk about Marc, but I think that's a minority report underneath the political progressive majority report. And I think we have to suss some things apart there. And so we're going to start on this idea of techno-optimism. I'm going to start with Libby in on this. I see multiple, and I read all of Andreesen's manifesto when it first came out, and I went back and I read it again just to make sure I was seeing the things that I was seeing. And I've never claimed to be highly educated. I just claim to be fairly intelligent. I think I can kind of manage. I think I'm okay. But it's not something I thump my chest about very much. On this podcast, I thump it a little bit, but other places, people just know I'm smart the second I open my mouth. I don't have to thump anything, right? It's the words I use. It's been that way ever since I was a kid. So I read through this wanting to be very clear that I was getting his ideas. And it struck me as being sort of a Theodore Roosevelt. It's the Rooseveltian version of progressivism, as opposed to maybe more of the current strain of cultural Marxism that we have that might be a little bit less Rooseveltian, let's say. And by the way, the people that I think of classically when I think of that are going to be like the Greta Thunbergs of the world, because he talks about climate change a little bit in his manifesto. But I think those are the people that are opposing him. It's that's who he's talking to. But as a person who might be more philosophically conservative, while I admire the optimism, technology to me comes off as another one of those things that's been brought down from the mountain, like all the isms of the 20th century were brought down from the mountain, and makes all these grand promises about creating a new man. And actually did a shorts episode, our last shorts episode, number 113. I don't think there's going to be a new man. And maybe that's me being pessimistic. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's why I can't go along with Marc, or I get off the train with him. Speaking of trains, I get off the train with him at a certain point. So I admire his ideas about moving technology forward. And I do agree there are things that are blocking the move forward of technology, but I'm not sure that the ruthless moving forward of technology is the solution to the meaning crisis that we currently have. Thoughts, Libby? I threw a bunch of salad there at you. And now you can sort through it.
Yeah. I think in a nutshell, what I got from him is that as long as individuals are focused on learning and growth and building, we have a society that is positive and hopeful about the future. And that when we get into the despair and the negativity, it's because we're not learning anymore. We prefer stasis. We fear change. He, in my view, is responding to what is the public narrative, and the fear-based narrative that is so prominent, in business, in media, in politics. And when I say it's prominent in business, I mostly mean, publicly traded companies that are scrutinized by regulatory, bodies and or NGOs or whomever. So for me, there is that real negative voice out there that's being pessimistic, and it's mostly in the media and politics, and big business. The route where I loved what he was bringing in, and not directly, but indirectly, is that right now you have a centralized power and a huge Leviathan that does not want to lose its power and its strength. and that's big business, it's big government, and all of those are going beyond the US, it's global. I tweeted something the other day about Davos actually being the recolonialization of the world, like Europe trying to recolonize. If you think about it, that's really what's happening. um,
Yep.
but we have all these centralized authorities that continue to want to grow, right? And they're threatened by change that might impact their ability to grow. So what are they doing? They're creating fear so you don't want to change. So you feel like there's no hope, it's only despair. They're lowering educational standards. Now, this was really interesting. Before we were allowed to consolidate power amongst a specific class because people weren't smart enough. Now, people are getting really wise to what's happening in the world, and they have more access to information than they've ever had before. Now, how well they actually use it and apply it is a question, but I actually think I don't know that there's somebody out there saying, oh, your society is getting way too smart, let's dumb down education. But it is interesting that in the state of Oregon, they just lowered, high school graduation standards. To get into the highest institutions, you don't have to have, SATs or ACH, or the standardized tests are going away. So what the hard knowledge and skills are being, the desire for those are being pushed down, while compliance to the rhetoric is being pushed up, and the rhetoric favors the big institutions and the power grab. So what I don't know that I think it's necessarily that technology is the salve for creating a better future, but the message around building, around growth, about learning, that is what takes you into a positive society that will continue to move up and to the right.
So a couple of things. I follow a Substack called The White Pill. I can't remember who the heck the authors are.
I have that too. I can't either.
I can't remember who the heck those guys are. I'll find the link and put it in the show notes. You should check it out if you're listening to this episode. And what they do is they, as you know, they aggregate like all the good things that are happening in technology and science, in those hard science spaces, healthcare, engineering, infrastructure, all of it, space. And we are doing amazing things in those spaces, which, by the way, do not get mass reported because of the doom cycle that we're currently, I fundamentally believe, getting ready to exit. I think we're at the end of the fourth turning, and we're going to cover the book The Fourth Turning in February on this podcast. Yes, we are. I think we're at the end of the fourth turning, and this is why I've structured my podcast this year going towards solutions, because when you get to the end of the doom cycle, and this is one area where I will absolutely agree with Mr. Andreesen on this, Marc on this, you need to start proposing solutions to problems, even if they're just wackadoo and they sound crazy and they sound like they would never work. When you're at the end of a doom cycle, when you're at the end of a fourth turning, the next thing that comes is a high. And no one who is doom and gloom in a turning, in a time of chaos, which is appropriate, by the way, in a time of chaos, is going to get anything looking like a leadership position during the time of a high. All those people will be abandoned and they will be left by the side of the road. And the people that will be leaders will be the people that promoted solutions, no matter how crazy they were, to whatever the crises and problems were that existed during that doom and gloom time. Those people become the leaders. They become the de facto people in charge. This is why Marc Andreesen's Techno-Optimist manifesto is so interesting, because it proposes a solution. And I think that's again, to go to the idea of a minority report, that's the minority report on this. That's why it riled everybody up so much, because it proposes a solution rather than the constant chewing over the freaking problem. We've all had enough of that. And I think Andreesen's pick up to something. I think he's onto something, as are the white pill guys, as are folks in other areas, not just on Substack, but other places where I'm seeing the green shoots of solutions start to come up, from religion and theology all the way to politics. I'm seeing people beginning to come out of the woodwork who are going to be the future leaders, proposing solutions to problems. And some of those solutions will work. 98% of them will not, but it doesn't matter. They've had the guts to propose solutions. So I'd rather be part of the solution proposing matrix than more of the problem talking about matrix, because we are at the end of the doom cycle. The second thing I'd like to say in response to what you said is, you mentioned Davros. If you want any better example of what the heck, I'm going to go ahead and do it. If you want any better example of late stage blind fascism, blind groping fascism, you couldn't find a better group of people at the World Economic Forum. My God, Hollywood couldn't make a better bunch of those people. I've said Klaus Schwab literally stepped out of like central casting as a Bond villain. Alex Soros, George Soros' son, I was watching some of his comments, and I just thought, there's a great line in Jurassic Park: The Lost World where Jeff Goldblum is talking to the guy who's the son of the guy in the first movie who created the disaster. And he goes, I knew John Hammond. You're like a bad copy of a copy. You're not John Hammond. But when you screw up large enough to be John Hammond, I'll be right there whispering in your ear, now you're John Hammond. Great line from Jeff Goldblum in The Lost World, Jurassic Park, the second Jurassic Park movie. And guess what? The guy screwed up large enough. He did. He screwed up large enough to be John Hammond. And when I look at Alex Soros and when I hear him talk, that's precisely what I hear. You're not your father. You're a bad copy of a copy. You may be younger, but you're not. You haven't made the mistakes. You haven't done the machinations. You're not the guy. You want to be the guy, but you're not the guy. Anyway, so Davros is a collection of people come out of Hollywood central casting, but they are late stage. It's late stage fascism. It's the late stages of big business and big government coming together to all sort of wash each other's hands someplace in Switzerland. Meanwhile, the rest of us, and I didn't talk about this with Woodrow Wilson, but it does tie in, the rest of us are doing the populist thing, particularly in America, and I think globally, we're doing the populist thing. We're getting up and getting after it. And a lot of that, and this is why the pressure is so much on, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years, because they feel their control slipping. With that being said, I think technology can be part of the solution to the meaning crisis, but it's not the whole thing. It's an important part of the thing, but it's not the whole thing. And I also think there will still be those people who are going to pursue those hard solutions to hard natural problems, because there's always been those people and there always will be those people. But I think the level of talking about them has to increase so that people can be inspired to go forth and work with those folks. And I don't know anything about derivative calculus. I know nothing about any of that, but I do know that you need the right people in order to put together a rocket to go to Mars. I know that. And I know that that's really hard.
Yeah, I do. I agree that we're at the late stage of the fourth turning.
Yeah.
I also agree that what we've observed over the last 5 years is the beast fighting to stay alive. And I think I referred to it as the whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
In our in one of our last discussions, but their playbooks are being used so frequently that we can now see them.
Yep.
And they're trying to like shut down any idea that is counter to what to their perceived solutions. The reality is we're on to them. We know the playbooks, and now people are emboldened. Yeah, the preference cascade has fallen, and people are now emboldened to actually say what they believe.
Well, and I also think they don't have any good ideas. Like
No,
I don't. You talk. So you
I
talk
agree
about
with that.
Andover,
It
Stanford,
was,
and Harvard.
yeah.
It's that whole thing. It's the
It was all
Andovers.
ephemeral. It was all
Ephemeral.
these
Yeah.
utopian ideas that had no founding and grounding in reality. Like
Right.
Alex Soros, I laughed. He's a PhD at Berkeley. I'm like, that explains everything. Have you ever met a PhD who actually can, deliver anything? They're all theory, right? And so he's in an intellectualized group. That being said, everything that I say, I wish I didn't have to do this caveat, is a stereotype, and it doesn't apply to everyone. I know lots of great people who went to Andover and Stanford and Harvard who are great people, but they also don't tell you that they went there.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Because that's not what matters. It's what they're contributing and doing with their lives, not the credentialing of where they went. But yeah, I don't think they have these ideas, and we now see them for who they are. They're empty vessels.
Well, and I think that is the other thing. So there's an idea, and I'm going to use a term that Jordan Peterson throws around a lot, and it's a good term in the biblical corpus. I love that term. So there's an idea in the Bible that, and it's not actually about Jesus coming back. It's about the structure of reality more so than anything else. So Jesus is talking about the structure of reality to his disciples, because his disciples they can be forgiven for not understanding this. They were fishermen and blue collar guys. They're not really spending a whole lot of time thinking about this, right? But he says, in the last days, right before my return, everything that is hidden and will be exposed, right? Things will be revealed, right? And the book of Revelations, again, the apocalypse is always a reveal. That's what the word means. It means a revelation. It doesn't mean an end of things. It means a revelation. It means an exposure. Okay. So this is an ancient idea, right? When systems come to an end, in reality, the veil is ripped away. The curtain is, again, at the crucifixion, the curtain is torn in two. Things that should have been that people should have been transparent about now are exposed, right? And by the way, this exposure is happening everywhere. It's happening in media, it's happening in big business, it's happening in politics. And to your point, people, the average whack-a-mole, the average mole is now really clear on what the exposure is. Now, with that being said, let's talk about this AI thing and the accelerationist movement and the deaccelerationist movement, because I didn't really know what that entire phenomenon was. And then I remembered from back in my days of tweeting at transhumanists like 10 years ago. With their utopian
I didn't know
schemes.
they existed back then.
Oh, yeah. I have the tweets to
You're
prove
ahead
it.
of the curve.
Oh my God, I have the tweets to prove it. With their utopia, their biological techno-utopian schemes that again aren't going to come to pass. They just are not. Or at least if they are, they're not going to come to pass with the consequences they think are going to happen. We see or we know that well, I didn't remember the Roko Basilik thing until I was reminded of it, because I totally completely forgotten that, right? So this is the idea that there's a super intelligent AI in the future, and that future AI is trying to get the AI to be built now, because if the AI isn't built now, then a bunch of people that die between now and then will be responsible for those deaths. So the super intelligent AI in the future is trying to make us not be responsible for those deaths, because it's a philosophical cul-de-sac. And to me, I hear Roko Basilik, and I know Elon Musk is a big fan of this, and my boy Elon, like, stick to cars and rockets, man. Stay out of the philosophy piece. But like I love you, sir, but really stay in your lane. I know he's a big fan of it. I know that like he dated one of his wives based on like them tweeting at each other about it, and they got married because they really liked this idea together. I don't know. It's a really weird way to pick up a woman, but okay, whatever you want to do, Elon. Knock yourself out. Whatever works. But that idea then translates into the deacceleration versus acceleration movement. So the accelerationists believe that we've got to build this AI fundamentally to appease the Roko Basilik 50,000 years in the future or whatever. And the deaccelerationists believe that we shouldn't, because that Roko Basilik is really a Terminator. Now that I've laid all that out, and my listeners, who are very much practical people, are now staring at their devices that they are listening to my voice coming out of, going, what is Hasan talking about?
Bezos Jeff.
Yeah, right, exactly. That guy getting doxxed. Good Lord. That's the best thing to ever happen to him. Okay, so let me ask you this question. I'm going to frame it in real terms for real people. Should we accelerate AI, or should we, like Sam Altman, go up, trot ourselves up to Congress and beg them to put handcuffs on us or on all the technologists so they don't do the thing that the technologists really want to do? Like, what are we doing here? And I know that Andreesen is part of the accelerationist movement, believes we should speed up our process towards this. What do we know about that, and how does this relate to techno-optimism? I kind of gave you a lot there.
Yeah, you gave me a lot, and I haven't really pontificated a lot, and I guess I'm allergic to regulation.
Yeah.
When I see,
let's make this I'm gonna let you make this very practical, because I went all heady and ridiculous. I want you to go very practical.
I'm allergic to regulation. When you see an industry pushing for regulation, it usually means that they don't want competition.
Right.
And so is that what Sam Altman is pushing for? I'm a believer, you need to have some regulation, but like the three-headed beast, a three-headed beast, it only gets larger. The regulatory bodies only get larger and larger. And I've been involved in enough regulated industries to know that you get into value destruction when you start to over regulate, and it no longer, you're more into managing the details that you really can't control anyway, like a central planning is really bad at. And if we're to provide the principles with which everyone was supposed to operate, you would better be able to manage the risk and continue to add and create value. I can get caught up in the narrative around why to be afraid of AI. Terminator comes to mind, right? And but seeing our centralized bodies as a mechanism for protecting us from that doesn't feel like an elixir. That it actually feels like it would move us faster to it than keep us away from it. And it's because those large institutions can get corrupted very, very quickly. And under the wrong leadership, it can be used against us. So I'm for broad principles. I'm for decentralization. I believe the smartest things, like Andreesen said, happen in a decentralized way. You need to balance centralization and decentralization, and we've over-indexed on centralization. So what I can say is I know the answer isn't regulation. From DC, I do not know what the answer is, though.
Yeah. Okay. No, that seems reasonable and pragmatic and well thought out. It also avoids all of the philosophical nonsense. And to me, a lot of that seems like dithering while Rome burns to a degree, or a mental distraction that doesn't relate to, a reality. However, I will say this. I do agree with Peter Thiel's perspective, where he said that AI is fundamentally totalitarian and the crypto is fundamentally democratic. So I kind of come down closer to teal on this. As to whether or not we should accelerate or deaccelerate the movement towards AI, I agree with you. I think we've oversold the doom and gloom because it works in a dramatic context and it's easier to sell a negative than it is to sell a positive. That's number one. Number two, I think we've oversold the benefits of these algorithms. So when I go and look at, and there's a couple of different large language algorithms that I use with the podcast to do sorting and prompting. I'm currently merging 3 websites together. We're using large language algorithms to do part of that work. To me, I look at some of this and I go, okay, I mean, I don't see a path yet, and maybe it's just because I'm blind. I don't see a path yet for a large language algorithm to go from where it is in the box in Mountain View or Cupertino or wherever it's in the box. I don't see a path for it out of the box. And there's so many things. This is an insight that I've begun to have really last year, and I really want to push this year. There's so many things happening outside the box of the internet, outside of the box of what's happening online. There's so many other things happening in that world that exists outside of the box that I think we probably should be figuring out how to make more of that stuff work better.
I agree. I'm a little jaded with technology, quite frankly, and you know, technology being kind of the traditional Silicon Valley stuff.
Yeah.
I struggle with what the definition. I can do a broad definition of technology, which is just in modern days, it's a solution or a capability
Yeah.
of many sorts. Like things that we might want to do around clean energy or that is a technology and I think there are smart things that we can do there. Cleaning up our food supply and are there technologies there that would help us with that? So if I think about it maybe in the broader, like what are the solutions that may have a technological component to it, I think there are a lot of things that are much more important, are equally as important, that just aren't as sexy from an investor perspective, so aren't top of mind with respect to what we're hearing about coming out of Silicon Valley or government, et cetera, because there's not a lot of money to be made in it.
Well, and I also think, to your point about regulation, you talk about the managerial class. The place where the managerial class will have its last stand, its Alamo, such as it were. I like that. The Alamo of the managerial class is the federal government bureaucracy. Not even your state governments, because your state governments will cut spending because they can't, at least in the United States. If you're listening to this internationally, I don't know what's going to happen in your country. You will have to look coherently and examine critically what your governments are doing if you're listening to this in another country. But in the United States, state governments cannot print their own money. And so at a certain point, you either raise taxes to the point where your populations move, i.e. California, or you have a fight over bureaucratic bloat every single step of the way, every single inch. And that is a lot of what you see in states like Texas and, quite frankly, Florida, is the fight over bureaucratic bloat. And that fight is vicious and brutal, and bureaucratic bloat comes from more regulation. And so, for every federal bureaucrat, where, they don't worry about large language algorithms. They don't worry about any of that because, number one, what do they care? But number two, it'll just be another opportunity to regulate something.
Yep. Tax.
Exactly. If you
build an organization around,
if it moves, tax it. That's right.
Create jobs around to manage and regulate. Oh, more power to us. Yep.
That's right.
Great.
Yep. So I do agree. We need to kind of look at all of this in aggregate. All right, back to the book. We need to turn a corner here. Back to the book. Back to When a Man Comes to Himself by Woodrow Wilson. Again, written between the time that he was in Princeton and before he became governor of New Jersey. This is going to be part 6. Every man, if I may adopt and paraphrase a passage from Dr. South, every man hath both an absolute and a relative capacity. An absolute in that he hath been endued with such a nature and such parts and faculties, and a relative in that he is part of the universal community of men, and so stands in such a relation to the whole. When we say that a man has come to himself, it is not of his absolute capacity that we are thinking, but of his relative. He has begun to realize that he is part of a whole, and to know what part suitable for what service and achievement. It was once fashionable, and that not a very long time ago, to speak of political society with a certain distaste as a necessary evil, an irritating but inevitable restriction upon the natural sovereignty and entire self-government of the individual. That was the dream of the egotist. It was a theory in which men were seen to strut in the proud consciousness of their several and absolute capacities. It would be as instructive as it would be difficult to count the errors it has bred in political thinking. As a matter of fact, men have never dreamed of wishing to do without the trammels of organized society, for the very good reason that those trammels are in reality, but no trammels at all, but indispensable aids and spurs to the attainment of the highest and most enjoyable things man is capable of. Political society, the life of men in states, is an abiding natural relationship. It is neither a mere convenience nor a mere necessity. It's not a mere voluntary association, not a mere corporation. It is nothing deliberate or artificial devised for a special purpose. It is in real truth the eternal and natural expression and embodiment of a form of life higher than that of the individual, that common life of mutual helpfulness, stimulation, and contest, which gives leave and opportunity to the individual life, makes it possible, makes it full and complete. It is in such a scene that man looks about to discover his own place and force. In the midst of men organized, infinitely cross-related, bound by ties of interest, hope, affection, subject to authorities, to opinion, to passion, to visions, and desires which no man can reckon, he casts eagerly about to find where he may. And he knew at last his neighborhood among men and tasks. What every man seeks is satisfaction. He deceives himself so long as he imagines it to lie in self-indulgence, so long as he deems himself the center and object of effort. His mind is spent in vain upon itself. Not in action itself, not in pleasure shall it find its desire satisfied, but in consciousness of right, of powers greatly and nobly spent. It comes to know itself in the motives which satisfy it, in the zest and power of rectitude. Christianity has liberated the world, not as a system of ethics, not as a philosophy of altruism, but by its revelation of the power of pure and unselfish love. Let's go somewhere with Libby. I haven't really gone anywhere, but we haven't really gone before. Let's go to the Transcendent. Now, I'm not going to try to nail Libby down on anything about what she believes. That's not the point of this. I believe people should believe in something. And when there's a vacuum, you will believe in something, whether it's identity or an ism or your neighborhood or your family or your community. You're going to put something at the top of the hierarchy because inevitably we build hierarchies. That's what we do. We place things in order. Elon Musk recently agreed with rapper Zuby. You may have heard of that guy, who tweeted a tweet describing the West as "quote unquote" screwed without Christianity. I agree, by the way. There are forces, and even Socrates and Plato acknowledged this about 2,500 years ago, as we read in the Republic of Plato, that are ineffable, that bind people together, and that cannot be legislated by governments of men. Wilson, as the son of a Presbyterian minister, recognized this fact as well, and recognized the key to insulating against overweening arrogance and hubris was the importance of religion. This is why he ends with this idea of Christianity as a system of ethics that binds people together in the trammels, such as it were, of organization. Now, I would assert that Wilson filtered his Christianity through his politics, and every man must come to salvation and work it out, as Paul said in the New Testament, with fear and trembling. There's no such thing as collective salvation. We're all going wherever we're going individually. But this is where also the problem lies for purveyors of postmodern progress, right? Once religion is abandoned, which we have abandoned religion, I think we can all agree on that, or at least we've abandoned religious language. And the transcendent positive forces are no longer in play, unpredictable chaos and disorder then begins to reign supreme. I mean, all you have to do is walk through modern day downtown San Francisco, or check out the immigration issues on the southern border in Texas, or the challenges of holding onto a Walgreens franchise in downtown Chicago when anybody can just come in and take from you upwards to the tune of $900 and not be stopped. You want to see breakdown of social order when Christianity goes away? Those are just three big examples. Because at the end of the day, if I'm a secular materialist, not necessarily an atheist, just a secular materialist, then it's relative, right? Moral relativism comes, and there's no transcendence in moral relativism. There's just me. I'm at the top of the hierarchy with my needs and my appetites, my impulses, and my base desires. And I'm going to fulfill them, whether it screws you or not. Like I said, I agree with Elon and Zuby. I think we need to recapture Christianity, and I think that would surprise the modern progressives of the early 20th century how far we moved away from that language. I think it would shock them, actually, even though many of them were scientific rationalists. I think it would shock them how far we've gone. This is going to be a tough one, Libby, but how do leaders acknowledge the need for transcendence, right, in their worldview? Because worldviews do matter. I've been asking all of my guests this year, and I will continue this year, about worldview, because I think how people think as leaders really does matter. What's their concrete? What are they coming from? Where does that? Who laid that concrete, right? And I don't think we nearly think enough about this as leaders. So, how can we acknowledge the need for transcendence in our worldview? And by the way, you can frame that as Christianity. You can frame it if you want as something else. I believe Christianity is the best, but okay, other people are going to have other opinions probably. But that's where my worldview comes from. And I believe it is part of the worldview of the West, and it has worked out for better rather than for worse. And the ability, by the way, to see the worse is also part of Christianity and to stare at the warts and not just sort of go, oh, everything's perfect. No one's doing that. I don't know any theologian going back 2,000 years is doing that. Nobody is doing that. So, but that's unique to the West. What do we do if we abandon the transcendent? What do leaders do? How do they acknowledge that? Maybe not necessarily in the workplace every day when they're leading, but how do they get their arms around that?
It's a theme that I've touched on a couple of times today and probably in our prior podcasts, but our prior discussions. But I do believe kind of in that servant leadership, and it's about motivating around helping others to unleash their potential, to see their potential, and from that, I know for myself as well as observed in others that when we're giving, that when we're giving and sharing, that is when we feel the most positive
Mhm.
and abundant. That when we're focused on ourself restricting, othering, hating, that uh, that's contagious, and it also leads to destruction and despair and depression and all those things. So the positive, by giving, by focusing on learning, by focusing on accepting others, we actually create a positive place, be it society, world, team, office, you name it. you know, Focusing on helping others to unleash their potential is where we thrive. What religion, and you can look at across all religions, when they're focused on serving others, they are actually focused on serving others. They can
Mhm.
get bastardized by bad leaders,
Mhm.
because every institution those who want to rise to power, many times are those who actually shouldn't have it. Those who
Mhm.
get power only through having built trust and done good. There's a lot of those out there, but all institutions can be bastardized. But
Mhm.
at the essence of all religion is about love. It's about do unto others as you would have done unto you. Um, what we see a lot in this narcissistic Western world right now is what have you done for me? What have you done for me? And when I look back at JFK's speech, ask not what your country has done for you, but what you've done for your country, he'd be laughed out of the room today. But for me, that is an organizing principle. Is like, what can I do for my country? What am I contributing? When I look at the homeless problem in California, and we're giving individuals $600, $700, $800 a month, and they're doing nothing in return for that. They're actually degrading our societal experience and not elevating it, or at least neutralizing it. Where is that common bond around being a positive contributor to an organization, to a society, to any group? And
Well, and I'll
we've
go a
lost.
step well, and I'll go a step further. Yes, that absolutely for sure. And I think that most people of a conscientious bent who are maybe more materialistic stop there, because that's a hard enough hill to climb over. Yeah, absolutely. You talk about this is why I'm opposed to universal basic income, like at
I
all levels.
I
I
don't
mean,
understand. Like, it would just destroy society.
it's yeah,
Yeah.
it's if it's not satanic, it'll do until Satan shows up.
Yeah.
Okay. And by Satan, I mean chaos and confusion and despair,
Exactly.
all of those
All of
things,
that. Yep. Because
all
you
of
don't
that.
have any meaning in your life. You're not
Right.
working towards anything.
Exactly. And so, but the next step there that I take as a person with that religious language is I go, you're also robbing that person of their soul. You're robbing them of something ineffable, or and maybe you're not going in and snatching it out immediately, but instead what you're doing is you're grinding it down with every single payment you give them. And this is
It-
the thing that's unstated underneath welfare programs, or unstated underneath UBI, or unstated underneath these social programs that again come out of a Rousseauian worldview that says you're fine, society's screwed up.
it's interesting you say this, because I had this precise conversation Saturday, and for me, well, I dealt with my own struggles with addiction, and I remember the day that I decided to turn my life around. I was looking in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the person who was looking back at me. And it
Mhm.
wasn't the face; it was that I had no light in my eyes anymore.
Mm.
I could not see my soul, and I was decided, today I'm
Yeah.
either going to change my life,
Yep.
or I'm going to kill myself, because this isn't living.
Yep.
And so when I look at the the drug addicted individuals in San Francisco, their animal reptilian brain is completely in control.
Yep.
They are not, their heart and their soul is so deeply hidden in them that it doesn't have any sort of voice. And the programs that are keeping them, in a constant state of addiction are, as you said, keeping them from living a soul-based life, keeping them from their heart driving their life, from their soul driving their life. They are just on a fast path to death. Their soul died long ago. It's in there though, and that's the piece. I'll bring up Oprah again, because Oprah, I loved her before the politics. The politics, I don't care
Yeah.
about people's politics. What she said is everyone just wants to be seen. These people who are on the street, where they're someone's children, maybe someone's brother, someone's parent, and they had dreams and hopes and aspirations at some point. They're buried in there somewhere, but
Mhm.
how can we help them to find that soul again? And it starts with treating them with some dignity, but also tough love.
Yep.
Because like there need to be consequences. Like that's the only way that they can get out of being the limbic brain driving them, and society reinforcing that your animal brain is okay to drive you. That's what the 7 deadly sins are all about. The 7 deadly sins are saying your animal brain is what should drive you. Ignore your heart, ignore your soul. And when you're ignoring doing positive change, when you're ignoring love and giving to others and growing and learning, you're allowing your animal and your reptilian brain to control you. And that only leads to selfishness and self-destruction.
We read the end of last year. We read at episode number 88, The Burglar's Christmas by Willa Cather. Willa Cather, who wrote My Antonia, and was kind of she was an East Coast writer who wrote very lyrically about immigrants in the Midwest, right? And the story of A Burglar's Christmas is about a guy who abandoned the farm, basically, going back to this idea of Iowa going to Stanford. Well, he left Nebraska and went to Chicago in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. And he did all these things in Chicago, and none of them worked out. And fundamentally, he wound up lying, cheating, and on the street. And in order to get his last meal on Christmas, he decided he was going to go and steal. He was going to go rob this house, right? And Willa Cather writes it from his perspective, right? And the irony there is that the house that he's robbing is the house that his wealthy mother and father moved to from Nebraska to Chicago, trying to find him.
Yeah.
And she wrote this, had to have been in the early 20th century. So like 1915, 1916, sometime around there is when she wrote this book. It wasn't one of her more popular, not book, but short stories. It wasn't one of her more popular short stories. And it is this idea that, and this is part of the reason why I read it for Christmas, because Christmas is about forgiveness and that Christian idea of renewal and redemption and coming back home and all of that. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's something that you said there that I want to click into. The institution that is going to make people whole is not the state. It's going to fundamentally be, and not even be the community. That's even too large. Mm-hmm. So the community, the Tenderloin district of San Francisco can't make any of those drug addicts in San Francisco whole. I've been to the Tenderloin district before it got really bad, and it was on its way to getting bad. That district ain't going to make anybody whole. A government bureaucrat or government program ain't going to make anybody whole. Fundamentally, the thing that's going to make people whole is exactly what was in The Burglar's Christmas. It's going to be family. In whatever conception of that it is that you come up with. And I can't believe we're at that point where we have to, well, we've been at that point for a while where I have to say that. But I mean family in the broadest sense of a collection of people who care about you enough to tell you to stop or to rescue you, even if they may do it badly, even if they may do it fumblingly, even if they may do it with mixed motives and ill intentions, even if they may do it from a position of material poverty, because they don't even have anything to give you materially, but they know enough to see your soul and to tell you to stop. Wealth isn't the thing. Pure motives isn't the thing. Education and credentialing and experience, all the things we talk about, those aren't the thing. The thing that's going to pull people out of that is going to be family. It's going to be those ties that bind. And I think that the solution to our problems in the future, we're going to turn the corner and talk a little bit about solutions as we come to the end of the fourth turning, I think is going to have to be a revivifying, and it won't look like what it looked like before on the last high. It can't, but a revivifying of family.
I agree that family is a component of it. I also believe that it's about creating conditions for people, for individuals to prove to themselves that they're worthy. Um, when you're
Yeah.
given handouts, as you were talking about, like welfare programs or, or handouts, or you're overpaid for your work, or you're not being fired and, you're not delivering and you're not being fired. People know when the expectations for them are low and they're
Hmm.
not having to prove their value, and that gets them into their own shame cycle, whether they're conscious of it or not.
Yeah.
So with with programs to help people who are in high addiction, or I mean, some of them have just such mental are so mentally disabled at some point that it's almost impossible to pull them back.
Yeah.
But there needs to be the exchange, in exchange for a warm bed and food, you actually need to do chores.
Right.
Like, so there's some exchange where someone can express with what they have, a return of this is what I'm giving back. I'm feeling a sense, and even just an inkling of worthiness. Like, we make a lot of, we place a lot of importance around the big milestones, and we underscore the value of small moments, and those small
Mhm.
moments are the moments that actually can help pull someone into a place of grace and thankfulness, where they can start to feel their soul self again. And the soul self is that worth, like, I am worthy, I can contribute. We know when we're not. And right now we have a society that everyone's like, what are you doing for me? And they're in such desperation and despair because they're looking externally for all of the answers, where internally, if they just started to stop and give, they might find happiness.
Roosevelt and Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton kind of had to be shoehorned into this idea. He was a little resistant to it,
But he did it.
but he did it. Welfare to work programs and the works programs in the Great Depression, slash World War II. Um, and I know many political conservatives that will grumble at me who are listening to what I'm about to say, but I'm about to give praise to both those programs, because, quite frankly, the WPA programs of the Great Depression gave people meaning
Agreed.
when previously, during previous economic downturns, um, kind of the response from people was sucks to be you, honestly. And then people moved on. Now, again, our culture has changed. It is dynamic. But again, you saw this in the 1990s, right? Newt Gingrich and the Republicans in Congress, they shoehorned Bill Clinton into this idea of welfare to work, because it works, because it's fundamental, right? And so I look at like our infrastructure problem, right, in the country. We got bridges that are falling down. We have roads that need to be repaired. All these kinds of things, right? Everybody talks about the infrastructure. Well, we got all these bodies walking around, and I know the unions and all of that. Okay, there's the details to be worked out, but the role of the state is not to give people inspiration or hope. The role of the state is to move roadblocks so people can go do the things that will give them meaning. And while politics cannot solve for the transcendent, and never can, and I think that's another thing that we're doing badly in our time right now. We're looking for politics to solve transcendent problems. It can't do it. I think that politics can solve for moving away the material roadblocks. And sometimes that may mean some firing some administrators or reducing their power. And I think you start small in places like San Francisco and New York and LA, but the level of political courage that takes, I think Woodrow Wilson would say that a man has to come to himself to find that political courage.
Great segue.
I think he would say that.
Yeah.
Um, Rounding the corner here, we're at the moment. Um, final thoughts. What are some leadership lessons we can take from Woodrow Wilson, from the things we've talked about today, from when a man comes to himself?
I loved the theme for today, and I'm going to end it on a positive note.
Absolutely.
And when when I read the essay twice, maybe more than that, but for two thorough reads, and I I know at the age that I am now that I appreciate the reading and I understand it. Coming to yourself, and it's about moving from service to self to service to others. And and some of us find it, some of us don't. But there's a line in here about necessity makes it challenging to move beyond self. And so that's why I do think that we find wisdom in our later years, because in our earlier years we're trying to figure out, like, how do we put food on the table? How do we add value in business? How we're trying to find those answers so that we can actually get to a place where we can maybe lean back a little. When we lean back, we realize, no, I'm not leaning back and no longer contributing. I'm leaning back to see where there are opportunities that I can contribute. So necessity makes it challenging to find service to others. I don't believe that it's impossible, but it's hard to see beyond your own wants and needs when you're trying to figure out how to put food on the table, and and get to a place where money isn't the driver, economics isn't the driver, it's providing solutions to society that's the driver. And for Wilson, it was right before he moved into being the president of Princeton, and then governor and president, where he decided he needed to make a bigger impact and he was being of service to others. For technologists like Marc and Ben, and I'd like to think myself, I've always been that person who is thinking about, I need to grow and create value for others. If I understand what others' wants and needs are, then I can create value for them, and be of service to them. So it got beyond, money just provides freedom for optionality to be able to pursue things that you may not be able to have pursued when you're just trying to meet base needs. But service to others, I think, the Bible and other spiritual doctrines, I've always been, at one point I thought I could convert to Judaism, because what I loved about Judaism is the sense of family and community, that the value of education and until I've never claimed to be the smartest kid in the room, and amongst my Jewish friends I always felt intellectually inferior, and I always want to I'm always setting high bars for myself, and so it was a commitment to education, the commitment to family and community, and they also do have a servant oriented, where they're builders, they're not consumers. And those three things have always been extremely valuable, either implicitly or explicitly, in what I pursue and how I lead and how I mentor others.
I think that is a excellent note to end on. I want to thank Libby Unger for showing up to the podcast today. This is going to be her first of 7 times she's going to be on the podcast this year. Always a pleasure to hear from Libby. Always a pleasure to get her insight. I always find out new things about her and her experience, and about her insights. Every time I ask her new questions and kind of push her in different directions. And so this was great. This was awesome. I had a great time with you today.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you for inviting me to this table. And it's just a delight to be able to also get your perspectives and voice. It's incredible. And I love listening to you when it's not just the two of us. You have a great perspective and a great voice.
Awesome.
Both literally and figuratively.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, and with that, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show. As it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.